Hey everybody! Welcome to Friday the 13th, the series. I'm your producer, Robert.
And I'm your guest, Jeremiah.
And after a complete, spoiler-filled recap of the episode, we are going to discuss the show you either just learned existed or always wondered how it existed. We promise the answers will be few and far between because we're just here to have some goofity fun exploring a show that, despite or possibly even because of its faults, isn't good and isn't so bad it's good, but is still somehow oddly charming. Let's dive in, shall we? On the off chance anyone is still listening to this review after 3 long, grueling installments, Jeremiah and I are back. Not to praise the David Cronenberg episode, but to bury it. And if you secretly suspected a critique this epic surely must conclude via an interview with the man himself, I assure you it does not. No, after a short recap of the end of the story, Jeremiah and I will finish discussing the episode, then attempt to puzzle out exactly where David Cronenberg fits in the hierarchy of great horror directors, before realizing the ultimate futility of that task and becoming adrift in the vast sea of epistemological ambiguity underpinning all formal classification systems. If you'd like to prepare for that impending existential dread and watch any and every episode of Friday the 13th, the series, for free, you can find a link on the Inner Demon Entertainment website on our podcast page. Now, let the navel-gazing commence. An uncharacteristically bellicose Jack insouciantly kicks open a crate filled with straw and what might be a terracotta horse statue. Forgive the unsolicited advice, but maybe don't curb stomp the demonic objet d'art. Mickey enters, grimoire in hand, to inquire about a demonic cape. I didn't think anything of her inquiry at the time, but Jeremiah has since informed me the next episode will, in fact, be about this cape. So Friday, I commend the inter-episode continuity. Jack vents about having one friend who tried to kill him, Jerry, and another who cursed all the objects Jack tracked down for him, Uncle Lewis. Then his emotional momentum compels him to utter the quiet part out loud when he all but states outright that he has to babysit Mickey and Ryan so they don't get themselves killed. My man, you're saying what we're all thinking. Mickey understandably takes umbrage at this unadulterated honesty and hits back with a reminder that they've all given up something to right Uncle Lewis's wrongs, then suggests if all she and Ryan are to Jack is a liability, perhaps it's Jack who should hit the bricks. Jack is so wounded he must not be thinking clearly because he begins to escalate without even pointing out the obvious. Ryan the Lion didn't give up a damn thing, and in fact tried to convince Mickey to run the store as a normal business before they even knew they'd inherited the sins of their uncle. Speak of the devil, Ryan saunters in wrapped in a blanket because he suddenly has a head cold. So, how long after the previous scene does this take place? I would have thought hours, but maybe he caught it over the commercial break. Of course, being Ryan the Lion, he can't simply wear a blanket. Oh no, but is compelled to accessorize with a playful herringbone scarf. Possibly elevated to the status of savant by illness-related delirium, Ryan the Lion is, for once, the voice of reason, laying everyone's emotional cards on the table and reminding them all they're the best of friends. Well done. Although the quasi-group hug at the end probably wasn't a capital idea given the crippling and highly contagious head cold. At Ryan's attempted departure, Mickey and Jack engage in a friendly rivalry over who has the better cure for a head cold. Granted, Jack's cure of rubbing garlic plucked under a full moon on Ryan's chest is pure superstitious hokum, but Mickey's prescription of 300 milligrams of oreomycin in a subcutaneous injection is just madness. I don't even have to know what oreomycin is because I know you don't inject medication for a head cold. So it's magic versus science, and if the jury was out on whether or not Mickey is our Scully, they just rendered the verdict. As they both turn to address an absconding Ryan, we freeze frame on them turned upstage. Just awful. The credits beg a host of questions from why is the kerning so wildly inconsistent to how is the character Joey Lessing important enough to get a 2-part name when I can't even in good conscience hazard a guess as to who that is? And who the hell was Faith Healer? It wasn't Jerry, Stewart, or Jack. Was there an entire storyline cut from this episode? End credits shouldn't be vexing. What is going on? One One little interesting bit on this is that Jack specifically mentions being mad at Uncle Lewis because Jack went around the world collecting all these items for him, and then Uncle Lewis saw that they were cursed by the devil. So it kind of had me wondering, like, wait, were these items all magical, and then on top of that, the devil cursed them? In which case we get into a real return of the curse of the creature's ghost situation here. God bless you, Mr. Show.
Oh, interesting.
Or were these just items and then they gained their powers because they were all cursed by the devil?
That's a good question that, having even watched the show, I haven't really thought about. I mean, a lot of them do have a history that's a little darker, but not all of them.
Probably not the Mulcher.
I would have made this assumption as a kid watching it for the first time, that the items are cursed specifically because of the devil.
That's a safe presumption, but with this show, it would not surprise me if they went with the overly complicated one.
Right. Yeah, no, certainly. And some of those items, like just in the way that they're made and presented, are freaking creepy.
Absolutely.
If somebody made this product to not be a cursed item, they got the aesthetics all wrong.
Oh, Vita from episode 1.
Right.
Case in point.
Right. Maybe it is a little bit of a mix of the two. These items already sort of having a little bit something evil about them, and then the devil just amping them up and then redistributing them.
It's like the glove. Takes something at one level and then amps it up and releases it at a much higher level.
And then releases it back into the world.
The glove is a perfect microcosm for how these work.
Right.
I know you've pointed out many favorite Jack moments throughout this episode, so I have to point to one, and that's him pointing out that Mickey and Ryan are kind of useless, and that he does the lion's share of the work, which is something I've been saying since episode 1. They're like, you and your cousin feel obligated to round all this stuff up, and if I wasn't here as your Sherpa, you'd die on the mountain.
Right. You wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. And
exactly.
Yeah.
I love that he's almost pushed to the breaking point and has to stop himself from finishing that sentence.
Well, you don't want to, you can't take it back once you say it, Jack. So good thing you caught yourself there.
Genie's out of the bottle, buddy. I gotta be honest, once again, it's only on like my 6th or 7th time flipping through this episode just now before the record that I realized why Ryan is sick at the end of it. I did not see the thematic tie-in until just now.
I was going to ask you the same question because I had the same thought when he comes down with that blanket. What's going on here? Why is he?
What the hell?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why are we doing this? In the last 30 seconds of the episode, are we introducing one of our leads? Should be bedridden, but for some reason is up and about. I presume it's thematic. It's the idea that this whole episode has been about healing.
Okay.
It also serves the purpose of then giving Mickey and Jack this fun little competition that breaks the tension that was developing between them. So it serves that function, and it's just a fun little bow on an otherwise pretty serious episode. But I would think that the reason why he's sick is because this episode is called Faith Healer.
Yeah. I mean,
you could have had Ryan fall down a staircase if you just wanted some comedy to break the tension or some other joke at his expense. But I think the reason why he's sick specifically is because it ties in with the whole healer aspect of this episode.
Right. And then they're going to come up with the remedy in their little back and forth bit.
Competition.
Yeah.
Science versus mysticism, because Jack has a new age cure and Mickey wants to use an injection, I think.
Right.
Kind of hardcore on her end.
Let's say, for instance, if they'd been out by a boat and if Ryan had fallen into water at some point, now he comes out with this cold.
If only Ryan had worn a saucy French beret, Jeremiah.
Right. So maybe it is the lack of proper headgear in a cold, windy, sea-breezed night that got him that cold. When Mickey is talking to Jack, she talks about a cape. That is what the next episode following this is about. So it's a little bit of that Quantum Leap style tease-in for what's coming up the next week. I don't know how often they did that, so actually I'd be curious, maybe as you go now, with that in mind.
Well, yes, as you were wont to do, you just busted a huge hole in my speculation that maybe these aired to some degree at least out of order because of Mickey's changing hair color from episode to episode.
They definitely aired somewhat out of order. Well, they often did air out of order, number one. And I know at least some of the episodes were produced out of order because I think the pilot episode, they actually held off and shot that later in the run.
Really?
Which is actually a common thing. A lot of times for chemistry reasons, you want to maybe hold off on shooting the pilot until the actors have spent a little bit more time getting their chemistry down by shooting other stuff. And then that way in the pilot, you can sort of hit the chemistry strong because you really want the chemistry to be strong in the first episode.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense from a production standpoint, but episode 1, to my memory at least, in terms of production value, just feels rough. it feels like we're just getting the gang together, figuring out our groove, not really making our days, rushing like you wouldn't believe. Even by this show's standards, that one feels a little bit shaggy. So the idea that they were already a well-oiled machine theoretically and then circled back to do that kind of blows my mind.
Well-oiled means that they probably just shot episode 2 and maybe 3 first, because they still need to get the pilot out so that it's ready to air in time.
Interesting. Thanks for the tip on that. Well, now your explanation about the first episode makes even more sense, because it specifically ends with almost the counter to that, where Jack spots something in the newspaper, turns to the camera and says, "Oh boy," so to speak, but does not say what the actual item is.
Right.
He does it in a way where you could slot that in anywhere.
Yeah. Well, and probably part of it too is, again, I suspect that this last scene probably also was not a Cronenberg scene.
Well, I definitely agree, because Ryan's sick, but he's not covered in scabies. His head doesn't explode. He doesn't crawl down a wall to enter.
There's no videotapes coming out of his body. Yeah,
Exactly.
There's no naked shower fights going on.
He's not giving birth. No womb on the outside of his torso. Which is a shame, because once again, I think it's one of the more interestingly lit shots in the entire episode.
From Cronenberg's standpoint, as a guest director, he probably wasn't all that tied into the story of these main characters because they're hardly in it. So to him, the final moment is really the Jerry and Jack.
Well, that blows yet another hole in my theory that Cronenberg must have filmed the exteriors of Curious Goods for this episode, because why on earth would you let someone film the outside of your main location yet again from still another angle? Isn't your bench deep enough that you can pull from what you already have at this point? I figured you must have only let him do it because he wanted to direct everything himself.
The run and gun of TV production, I don't think it would have been even possible for him to have done it all himself.
Well, I agree completely. Okay, I'm sorry. That was a facetious comment on my part.
Oh.
I just don't understand how this show that was so run and gun has allowed so many directors to shoot the outside of the store from so many different angles.
Oh.
I don't know. I guess they found themselves with a little extra time and just shot it from every conceivable angle all at once and have been parsing it out. I don't know, but it seems like every episode we see it from a slightly different angle, and some are day, some are night, so they couldn't have possibly done them all at once. And sometimes the production design looks a little bit different, so it feels like every episode, second unit went outside and shot it from a different angle, and I just don't understand why. This seems absolutely like the kind of show that would have shot it exactly one time, said we got it, and we're never shooting an exterior establishing shot again.
Well, I mean, that's definitely the way that they do it if it was a sitcom, right? Like, you're going to show the Brady Bunch house once.
Yep, that's exactly what I'm picturing.
1 hour dramas, though, they're usually more single camera style productions, where they're going to try to mix up the angles throughout the show.
Just a little surprising, but not as surprising. Not as surprising as the terrible freeze frames this show tends to end with. I come from a time, Jeremiah, where I remember freeze frames as the way that a lot of television shows ended. But in my memory, they were usually somewhat carefully composed. And it just seems like in this one, there are some weird, arbitrary choices about where they've decided to freeze frame.
So I'm trying to recall, what was the actual frame?
This one isn't the worst, but I pictured things where all the characters are relatively well composed in the frame and they all laugh at the same time. There's not one person whose eyes are half closed. There's not another person who was halfway to the smile, so it looks like a weird, uncomfortable rictus. And this, it just seems like when the clock hits, that's when we need to be out.
Right.
I know it's tedious and I know they were under the gun, but
right.
It just seems like sometimes they have some really unflattering shots, particularly of Ryan, halfway to making a facial expression. And it just seems like a really uncool thing to do to one of your leads.
Well, you know, Ryan isn't exactly the traditional leading man hero throughout the show in general.
Agreed. He lusts after his cousin.
He's sort of a dork, gets beat up by children at points, and like is constantly falling down or something.
Yes.
He's no Magnum PI. That's for sure.
You're saying it's in service of the story?
I don't know if I'd go that far to say it's in service of anything. I'm just saying it lines up by accident or not. You know?
No Magnum PI. Just once, I want to see them end with Ryan holding the gun up in the sexy profile pose.
He doesn't get the heroic shot, so therefore why should he get the heroic freeze frame?
Fair enough.
If you like the horror genre as much as we do, you can preview the horror comic book Requiem for a Psychopath right now, for free, at the Inner Demon Entertainment website. Imagine a world in which horror film slashers are real, Then imagine a troubled teen bringing one out of retirement to help him take revenge on his bullies. It was written by me and drawn by friend of the show, Stephen Yu. Again, that's Requiem for a Psychopath on the Inner Demon Entertainment website. And, if you dig it, please either review and rate it 5 stars on Amazon, or don't rate and review it at all. Ratings of less than 5 stars send the algorithm into murder mode for some reason. Thanks. I hope you enjoy it.
So I am genuinely curious to know, of our troika, who's your favorite, Jeremiah?
Oh, boy. Well, I think as a kid, I had a little bit of a crush on Mickey.
Totally fair.
Though Ryan, being the comic book geek, certainly made him more relatable. That's just something that you didn't see as much at the time. Obviously now, like, comic book culture's everywhere, but at the time it was a little bit more unique.
Another example of this show blazing a trail.
Jack is obviously the more stately actor.
Absolutely.
I also knew him from before the show. I'd seen him in the Henry Winkler American Christmas Carol.
Well, that's perfect. You beat me to it. Once again, I was going to ask if you knew this cast from anywhere else.
He's the only one, though. No, the other two I'd not seen previously.
I assume you're not familiar with Luis Roby's music career?
No, I remember it always being a little odd to me that she had the one name.
She just went by Roby.
In retrospect, it's like, oh, okay, going off of Madonna, people of that nature, Tiffany.
As was the style at the time.
Yeah, and I still don't know that I could tell you what any of her hits were, or if she even had hits. I don't know how stellar that career was.
From the bit of research I did, it seemed to be pretty solid. I don't think she was huge outside of Canada, but in Canada, it seemed like she had a pretty promising career.
Pretty promising in Canada. Yep, that sounds like a TV movie, frankly. Pretty promising in Canada.
Oddly enough, yes, call Hallmark.
Right.
Yeah, oddly enough, I just watched a Todd in the Shadows video where he was talking about Canadian performer and mentioned that Canada tends to subsidize its performers to some degree. So you can be pretty big there, but completely unknown outside of Canada. And there's some debate about whether or not that's actually better or worse for their industry and for the performers themselves.
For sure. To really hold me down to it, though, like which one's my favorite? As an actor, I think Jack, but I think probably as a character. Oh, how do I not spoil something? Probably Ryan the Lion.
Okay, so you're in the same boat with Hill Street.
Because Jack sort of is the third wheel, in a way. He's in a different age group.
He's a different ability level, certainly.
He's not playing the everyman character. And both Ryan and, to a degree, Mickey are playing people that are more like what we would be if we were suddenly finding ourselves dealing with satanic, cursed objects. It'd be a very different show if it was focused on him being the lead.
You know what I think he is, Jeremiah? I think he's the Mr. Roper of the show, making sure there's no shenanigans going on between the two cousins. I can't believe I have to say that.
Just constantly poking in, making sure he heard things correctly.
Popping up at windows, all Google-eyed.
Well, and no offense to the Trio of Three's company, but a lot of people at that time thought really Mr. Roper's the star of the show. So,
interesting.
The show was still successful when he left, but when the Ropers got a spinoff, a lot of people were like, well, that's kind of the end of the show, possibly, because he's...
If Urkel spins off of Family Matters, there's no more Family Matters.
Exactly.
Just what I needed to reach out to our youth demographic.
Yeah, we're really pulling him back in, right?
Yeah. I don't even think I was aware there was a spinoff called The Ropers.
Oh, yeah. No, there was a spinoff called The Ropers. It was, him and the wife.
I'll take your word on that.
Catch it on Nick at Night, folks. Also a thing that may not exist anymore. I'm not sure.
So have you seen any of these primary cast members since Friday the 13th, the series?
Well, Brian the Lion shows up in part 9 of the movie franchise. Not playing Ryan the Lion.
Good point.
When I eventually saw part 9, I was like, oh, interesting. I don't know how much that was a synergy attempt or just he's worked with these producers, so they're going to stick him in.
Why don't we move on to the supporting cast, the day players?
I mean, the Faith Healer, I thought there were a couple moments that he really had some subtlety that I was surprised by. And there's some creepy elements to his choices, or possibly Cronenberg's choices, I'm not quite sure. Now, for the debunker, that guy always stands out to me just because there's just something a little bit interesting about the way he performs and things. I've only really seen him in Cronenberg stuff. So yeah, in this he did about what I would have expected. As far as people playing, some of the other people who got affected with the curse, got affected with the body horror. It's really hard to judge because some of that stuff was just so over the top.
Well, we did get a little bit of a sense of the woman with the dog in Crime Alley.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, hers stands out because her visual expressions in that are very memorable. For what they were going for, she nailed it. That said, what they were going for seemed really over the top in a huge way. And I think it worked for what it was, but it's hard to really judge that on performance, or is that just simply she's just really good at making those type of over-the-top expressions?
Well, she is a voice actor, so she might be very experienced at playing it big. That actress's name is Catherine Gallant. I'm sorry, that's my best guess at how you pronounce her last name. But she actually worked on, of all things, the X-Men 92 through 94 series.
Oh, who'd she play?
Oh, that's a fair question. I don't know. I'll look into that, but I thought you would appreciate she did a voice for the Police Academy cartoon for kids.
Yes, another great example of a cartoon based on a movie that was not for kids at all.
They have her listed as Famine, Autumn Rolfson, and Shiro Yoshida.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Why is Shiro interesting? Because she's Japanese, one assumes?
Yeah, I would have thought.
It was a different time, Jeremiah.
This is true. And I guess if it was Canada voice actors, then maybe, I don't know. I can't make excuses.
Stop standing up for Canada. They know what they did. But yeah, 14 episodes between 92 and 94.
Interesting.
The only other person I had listed was Sylvia. I don't even know who that is. Played by Lynn Gorman. And I just noted her because she also worked on Videodrome. Apparently played a character called Masha, whom I also don't remember.
Yeah, it's got to be the older woman in the first one who gets touched by the glove.
I think so. Well, on the subject of Stuart Fishoff, I'll just mention, played by Miguel Fernandez, who worked in TV until 2005. As I mentioned before, he worked on both MacGyver and Stargate SG-1, but also the show Airwolf.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I never really watched Airwolf.
Exactly. That's another show that, much like Friday the 13th, the series, I've known about my entire life. Don't think I've ever actually seen any of it. And I'm kind of curious how they did a helicopter-based show back in the day.
So Airwolf used to play in syndication and in reruns. And it seemed like it was usually sort of packaged between the A-Team and something else that I would like. But in the middle of it was Airwolf, which just wasn't quite at my speed at that age. It was sort of like I saw it, I remember the theme song, but usually that's because I was like, oh, yeah, okay, it's Airwolf now. I guess I'll turn off the TV and go do something else for an hour or flip the channel or
go read some comics.
Or good time to go grab a snack.
This is not a top-rated episode according to IMDb. The episode before and after are. So what do you think about this episode as it compares to other episodes?
If top rated means top 10, I think I'd probably agree with that, despite the fact that it clearly has the most established and legendary director to come anywhere near this series.
Well, let me jump in real quick, and I will remind you that episode 3, Cupid's Quiver, was directed by Adam Agoyan.
Oh, true. No, that's a very good point, actually.
Director of 97's The Sweet Hereafter, and that's only on the tip of my tongue. Well, one, because I researched that episode, but two, because I wanted to actually ask you how you thought this episode compared with his.
Just based off of ancient memory, I think I'd be more likely to remember the Cupid's Arrow episode than what I was the Faith Healer episode. And I really like Exotica.
I was going to actually bring that up because probably Exotica and The Sweet Hereafter, those were the two that caught my attention as maybe interesting for discussion points.
Exotica is the one that I think I would pick Exotica personally. There's been a tragedy in this
small town.
Without giving any spoilers, because it is a thing that sort of takes twists and turns, and at the end of it, you sort of find out, you've been following these different characters throughout the movie, and you don't really see what's going on until you get to the very end and see how all these lives interconnect.
So kind of a dark drama?
Sort of a dark drama. It's a little bit of a mystery, but not in a traditional mystery, really, in the sense that you're trying to solve the crime, but in the sense that you're trying to put the pieces together.
I've got it up on IMDb. You got your Bruce Greenwood, your Elias Koteas, your David Hemblin, your Don McKellar, Calvin Green, Peter Krantz.
Yeah, Elias Koteas. He was coming off of probably Casey Jones right around there, and then has been in tons of things like The Thin Red Line and stuff like that.
I should mention there's Victor Garber, who probably most people would know as the, I want to say, captain of the Titanic in James Cameron's Titanic.
Yep. Yep.
But I'm really burying the lead here. I knew that Sarah Polley was an actress in The Sweet Hereafter. I did not realize she was also in Exotica.
Yes.
And for anyone just joining the podcast now, Sarah Polley made her screen debut. It was small screen, but still I'm counting it, as a child actress on the very first episode of Friday the 13th, the series. Cronenberg, well established when he did his episode, and I think that's reflected on the show, whereas based on Adam Agoyan's resume, I don't think that's reflected on episode 3, Cupid's Quiver.
His career didn't really take off till the next decade. His 90s films is where I think he really started to get recognized and did some of his best work. Whereas Cronenberg was arguably doing this in the middle of his peak.
Yeah, it's so weird. I can't get my head around it. Do you have any insight on that?
I don't. He'd literally just done The Fly, which has to be one of his biggest commercial successes.
Yeah, not necessarily his best, but his most commercial.
I think there's a fair argument. Some people would say it is his best. I personally really like A History of Violence. I think that's probably my favorite, which obviously came much, much later.
Yeah, that wasn't until 2005.
Fly might be number 2 for me personally. I think if you took a poll, probably The Fly would be both his most successful and people's favorite.
He done Shivers, Rabid, The Brood, Scanners, and Videodrome, and The Dead Zone, in addition to The Fly, all before Friday the 13th.
He goes from, his most outrageous film possibly with Videodrome. I mean, saying Cronenberg's most outrageous film could be like throwing a dart at a board, I suppose, but to then his most possibly could win you an Oscar film at the time being The Dead Zone.
Do you think it just comes down to being nothing but one of the idiosyncrasies of Cronenberg? Because I noticed that reflected in his choice of acting roles. Sometimes he takes the strangest roles, and I'm not going to list them all, but he was Dr. Wimmer in Jason X, of all things, and he was Man at Lake in To Die For.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
If you're going to be in a big film, which it was a pretty big film for its day, To Die For, you're not doing anyone a favor if you're Cronenberg to play Man at Lake.
No. Sometimes they put people in, actually, especially it seems like in the horror genre.
Sure.
They will randomly give a part to a never horror director. Ty West will show up in somebody's film playing a bit part, or John Carpenter was in the one that the Foo Fighters did.
Eli Roth showing up in Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards.
Yeah, so it seems like with horror directors, a lot of times that does seem to be a thing that happens. I don't know why that is specifically, and
Yeah, it's pretty arbitrary.
I wouldn't see that making sense in To Die For.
Yeah, I don't know what he got out of it or what anyone else got out of it.
Yeah, very arbitrary.
But then again, I haven't actually seen the movie yet, although it's high up on my list, so who am I to judge? Maybe Man at Lake turns out to be one of the biggest supporting roles in the whole film.
Yeah, I'd recommend it. I have no memory of Man at the Lake, though. So
I'm so disappointed, Jeremiah. Get out. That's it. Record over.
I think his next film probably after it is
Go ahead. I've got it right here in front of me.
Dead Ringers.
You nailed it. Yep. Dead Ringers, also 88.
So that's like one of his most critical successes. Seems like a lot of critics put that at the top. In big part because of the performance of Jeremy Irons, let me do that again.
Yeah, but I was actually going to ask you too.
Yes.
Although I might include this in the actual cut.
Feel free. Yeah. In part because of the performance of Jeremy Irons playing the two roles in that film. In the midst of his 80s peak, where he's doing The Dead Zone, The Fly, and then Dead Ringers, and right in the middle of it, an episode of television for a syndicated show on at 12 a.m. in Kansas City, in my area.
At the same time, I don't think it hurt his career because Dead Ringers he was probably working on at the same time because those came out at about the same time. So let's maybe not count that. But he still managed to do Naked Lunch and Crash. Never again would he have the success that he had for that streak in the 80s. But some of that's just time and luck as well. I wouldn't necessarily say that his career was over because he did Friday the 13th, the series. Naked Lunch, highly regarded critically at least, and Crash, at least a cult hit.
Crash was like a winner at Cannes.
And one little factoid you might not actually know, but circling back to the idea of him taking some pretty random acting roles and then randomly deciding to do this episode of Friday the 13th, in 2007, just 2 years after A History of Violence, he made a short film called At the Suicide of the Last Jew in the World in the Last Cinema in the World. You familiar with that one?
I have zero knowledge of this.
Yeah.
No, yep.
So iconoclasting pretty hard. Pretty esoteric.
Yeah. No, very, what a crazy career for him.
Yeah. It did not seem to hurt his career to work on Friday the 13th, the series. And in a way, that kind of reminds me of Tarantino randomly doing one episode of CSI.
Or ER, right around the time of From Dusk Till Dawn, which obviously sort of launched Clooney into becoming movie star caliber.
He was big enough. He was big enough to star opposite Tarantino.
Right.
So he can carry his own weight, obviously.
Right. Yes, and.
Oh, that's right. I forgot you work in the industry. Probably shouldn't speak freely on some of these questions. I'm the German throwing John Campea under the bus. So let me ask you this, Jeremiah. Would you tell anyone except a Cronenberg completionist to watch this episode?
Lane, just slightly tailor the question or clarify the question, but...
Oh, no, feel free to just answer whatever question you want to. You don't have to answer mine.
Blue 27. If I was saying study Cronenberg, then yes.
I would slide that under the completionist category.
If I was pointing to it as landmark TV or as even let me pick out a couple of Friday the 13th episodes to point you towards, no, probably not.
Right. It's not a high water mark of his career, and it's not one of the best episodes of the series.
It's not in the top 10.
I think it makes your top third.
Yeah, I'd say probably it could. I think, and it's true of most of these types of shows that lend the anthology style with the serialized style. When you do get to an episode that really focuses on your main cast, those episodes stand out a lot. Those episodes get a little bit more fanfare. But then outside of that, I think as far as filling a top 10 or a top 20, there's ever episodes that stand out more with a little bit more interesting plots, a little bit more interesting curses, a little bit more interesting villains or environments or gimmicks. The gloves was sort of a weird object. The body horror element and the Cronenberg elements definitely elevates the episode. That's about it.
Yeah, I really wonder what the episode would have been like if Cronenberg hadn't directed it and hadn't brought his unique vision of body horror to it.
Probably would have really been a very mid episode. Maybe not even made the top half for me personally.
They brought him in to Belushi it and just saved the entire concept.
Yeah, I think the Cronenberg edition probably takes it from being right in the middle to maybe being in the top third.
You passed. Barely. You know what you got? F+.
Yes.
Both the episode before and the episode after are considered top-rated episodes. Based off of your memory of them, how does this compare with those?
The episode coming up, there's at least one element about it that makes it really stand out. At its time, not something you were seeing on TV. And something that later series also did to great fanfare, but that this episode coming up did first.
Uh-oh. Is this the blackface episode?
No.
Are you talking about Different Strokes?
No, but without spoiling it, because, I want you to experience it in real time when you see it.
If you come back for that one, we might have to record it live.
How much of that is because it is a gimmick, or how much of that is because it's a quality episode? That I don't quite recall. I would need to revisit.
Am I going to have to put on my 3D glasses?
Yeah, you might have to dip back in time.
It's like Ryan's guitar is coming right at me.
Right. Well, yeah, we're going to bring out all the Tingler effects and all the William Castle. You'll be sitting in the hot seat, quite literally.
Looking forward to it. Are you suggesting that perhaps the previous episode is top rated just because of the scarecrow element?
I think, and again, I've not seen that episode in a while either, so I can't dig into the nitty gritty of the details of it. But I would be more likely to say, yeah, that probably is more likely to be a top episode based on the quality, because I don't think the scarecrow gimmick was such a gimmick to where that would do it.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you had previously asked me if I thought this was one of the more shocking things from television from this time that I knew of or that I remember seeing on TV as a kid around that time. And I said, yeah, probably. And then it occurred to me there might be one thing that gives it a run for its money. And that was actually the episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. If you were alive at that time and you were a kid and you saw it on TV, you know which one I'm talking about. It's Conspiracy, but we all know it as the Bug episode.
Right.
Do you more or less agree with that?
Star Trek: Next Generation, also syndicated, also a Paramount series, same as Friday the 13th, and also a big success, significantly more so was something that changed the landscape of syndication.
And to be fair, it was a big gamble when it came out.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, all these more expensive projects going into the syndicated market instead of being direct to network was a gamble, for sure.
And I just mean bringing back the series in general. People forget the original series ran for 3 seasons.
Yeah, I mean, the original series was expensive as far as TV shows go.
Right, which is why every other episode found a reason to travel through time and end up on the Universal Studios New York City street set.
Right. The grotesquerie, it might have one-upped this, but it one-upped it after this had already happened. So obviously, this led the way in what I'm about to point out as an example. After Friday the 13th series had gone to syndication, become a big hit, there was a show called Freddy's Nightmare.
Oh, here we go. Carve out another hour of your schedule, people.
Freddy's Nightmares, which also was a anthology show for the most part that was hosted by Freddy Krueger. It was like, oh, Friday the 13th gets a TV show? Well, let's give Freddy Krueger a TV show. And it pushed the envelope in some ways. I've not seen that in quite some time. I don't think it's as well respected as Friday the 13th, the series. I don't think it's as referenced.
It's even harder to find, I'll tell you that.
I don't think it's ever been put on DVD. I don't think it's ever been put on Blu-ray. I doubt if it's available for streaming anywhere. But yeah, it also would push the envelope, doing things that you would expect Freddy Krueger to do. So yeah, I'd say this was the thing that probably pushed the envelope the most in those areas. And also, not just in terms of horror, not just in terms of gore, but in terms of sexuality, in terms of any number of things. It was really doing something that you did not see on broadcast television, ever, at that time.
Speaking of trend-setting series, my last question was just going to be to ask you about possible influence from Kolchak the Night Stalker. Also, I think you'd agree, a groundbreaking series in the horror genre on network television.
Kolchak's really good, and actually it's a good point to clarify something. We've mentioned a couple times how Friday the 13th influenced the X-Files and influenced all these things. Kolchak also.
Yes. Yes.
Well, yes. I've mentioned this several times.
It's the entire DC universe is predicated on the existence of Friday the 13th, the series, folks. You heard it here first.
Kolchak, without question, also a big influence on the X-Files and a big influence on Monster to Week television. That said, I think it's two different influences. If Kolchak's the mother, then Friday the 13th's the father of that formula. Kolchak was still very much focused on Kolchak. Unlike this, you wouldn't see half the episode spent with the faith healer and the debunker. The mixing of anthology and serialized horror into this combo pack is Friday the 13th's contribution. And the X-Files clearly was doing that. I'll even go farther, because Smallville, it's less obvious, except for when you actually look at some of the cues and things like that, where it's, oh, I think they're almost referencing Friday the 13th series at times. I think that musical cue is almost a little homage to what Friday the 13th series was doing.
Do you think it influenced the show Buffy the Vampire Slayer?
Yes, and again, similarly like Kolchak being a different influence on that show, or influenced by something that was influenced by the X-Files or something along those lines. But the fact that in the Kolchak world, all these monsters exist, and every week he's just going to encounter one at a time, that's an element that carried on with and was influential on X-Files, on Buffy, on Smallville, too, especially in those first 2 seasons.
Well, you've convinced me. I actually now want to go back and watch some of those shows because other than the first couple seasons of Supernatural, I haven't seen almost any X-Files, no Buffy, and no Smallville. So I would be very curious now to watch some of those and look for the influence.
With something like Smallville, I think it's really in those first season or 2. Once the show gets a little further in, it becomes more of a comic book show. It moves a little bit away from the Monster of the Week and moves more into like season-long stories, moves more into the Superman lore and the Lex Luthor lore. But if you watch those first 2 seasons, I think you would undeniably see the influence.
I know I give Friday the 13th, the series, a hard time, but I am glad I found it. It has been eye-opening, and it's interesting to learn about its influence. Thank you for the contribution on that.
It really was groundbreaking, and it really is something that the industry still makes reference to this day. One thing I did want to ask you, and this being the Cronenberg episode, there's no better time to ask, how familiar are you with his work, and where do you sort of rank him in the Masters of Horror?
You ask full well, knowing that I only finally saw The Fly a month ago at your place.
Well, true, but that's a big one that you can now judge.
I've only seen about a third of his oeuvre.
What have you seen, actually? Let's start with that.
I have seen Scanners, Videodrome, The Fly, History of Violence, Somehow I missed At the Suicide of the Last Jew in the World and the Last Cinema in the World.
Right.
Don't know how that one got past me. And then, yes, a few years back, I saw Crimes of the Future. To answer your question, though, if I'm going to be honest, the unfortunate truth is, what do I think of him? I guess the problem is I kind of don't. He's the director who always kind of slips through the cracks, even in the horror genre.
Mm-hmm.
He's that guy that whenever anyone brings up one of his films, we're like, oh yeah, Cronenberg's great. Oh yeah, he did that one or he did this one. But when we're just sitting down to talk horror for sometimes hours on end, we get through the conversation without his name or his movies coming up once. It's weird. It's not fair. Lord knows the man makes memorable films, still getting over scanners. And I wouldn't even call him a cult director. He has had a good deal of mainstream success, often at various points over the decades. Sometimes it's a run of films. Sometimes he disappears for a while and comes back with one that puts him on the map again, and then he kind of disappears again.
Who do you put up there as the ones that you do find yourself talking about?
Carpenter, Craven, well, put Kubrick on there for exactly one film.
No, that's not fair.
Yeah.
No, that's not fair.
I'm not going to do that. Listeners of the show know that I've shared my thoughts on comics. I like comic books, but I'm kind of particular. I would say the same thing to a large extent about films. There's a lot of films that I completely understand why some people just write off the entire genre as garbage. And I like very specific films. Not even so much specific directors, but specific films.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't like enough films from any one director to be like, oh yeah, he's one of my, or she's one of my favorite horror directors. I'm usually cherry picking 2 or 3 films from their entire career.
Mm-hmm. I'll probably put him in my, and for me, thinking horror directors, like I'm not going to count Kubrick, I'm not going to count Friedkin or De Palma. Probably not even Joe Dante, who often has those type of elements and has certainly done horror films. But a lot of my favorites for him is something like The Burbs or Gremlins, which kind of has horror elements, but isn't exactly in that genre.
The Burbs. Nice cut.
Spielberg, De Palma, they've touched the genre and they've touched it in epic ways, but I don't count them as horror directors. Just looking at the people who I would count as horror directors, he's certainly in my top 10. He's not in my top 5. I do take the approach of looking at a lot of his stuff from the vision of looking at director, looking at their body of work, and finding more admiration for individual films based on that body of work sometimes. I'm big on auteurs, and of all the horror directors, he's the most auteur of them in a lot of ways.
That's fair.
Despite that, he's not really in my top 5 as far as horror directors go.
Just to take one more stab at attempting to answer your question, as you yourself pointed out when we weren't recording, but just hanging out at your place a few weeks back, even John Carpenter gets lumped in with horror directors when much of his filmography is not horror. And I think that's more than fair to say about Cronenberg. Truth be told, I would probably not classify him as a horror director, even though his films are often horrific. I'm actually more surprised by the fact that several of his films that people call horror films, when I go back and investigate them myself, without the framing that other people seem to have, I see more like a thriller or a mystery.
Right.
Something like that has body horror, which is a genre. I feel like for a long time, he might have had a monopoly on the genre of body horror. When I finally saw Scanners, I thought, oh, this is almost like a thriller. I guess what I wasn't expecting was a story about this organization of people with special abilities that is sort of on the run from the government, but they're using their powers as sort of chaos agents. And honestly, it kind of reminded me a little bit of the X-Men. Obviously with more gore than most X-Men comics, although there were a couple of exceptions and some gruesome deaths. And some of them are dramas, but I mean, when you look at films such as Cosmopolis, Eastern Promises, A History of Violence, Naked Lunch,
Right.
Crimes of the Future.
Crimes of the Future, for sure, yeah. I would still put Carpenter on my Masters of Horror list because I think at least half of his body of work is enough horror to count. But it is like half.
Sure.
He was jumping back and forth into the genre, and then there came a certain point in his career where he just committed to it.
It's where the work was.
But he had so many great films like Big Trouble in Little China and Starman, and They Live, more of a sci-fi action movie, Elvis. But then he sort of hits this run of In the Mouth of Madness and Prince of Darkness and Vampires, where towards the end of his career, it's almost exclusively horror. I think that's true of most of the people even that I would count. They're not stuck to one genre, nor should they be. As creators and artists, they should be able to explore. Part of that conversation was how Wes Craven was stuck being a horror director in his mind. I think that would be the way he would phrase it, not the way I'm phrasing it. He wanted to explore other genres. He wanted to have opportunities to dip in their things, and just very rarely got that opportunity, unfortunately.
Right.
I'd put Carpenter on the list, and for that same reason, I put Cronenberg on the list. Horror is a big enough representation of their career compared to Kubrick or Hitchcock or Friedkin.
Right. But he doesn't make your top 5.
No, I mean, I think Carpenter, Sam Raimi, Polanski, although not as a human being, but, as a filmmaker, to clarify that for everybody.
Okay, good. I don't have to cut that out now.
Yeah, James Whale, going back to the 30s. Wes Craven.
So no Tobe Hooper.
Tobe Hooper's probably in the top 10. Guillermo del Toro probably in the top 10. George Romero, Cronenberg, we've already said. So that's 9 right there. And I think that there's probably 3 or 4 names that are sort of hitting their stride now, or their legacy's not fully cemented yet.
Robert Eggers, Ari Aster.
The Robert Eggers, the Ari Aster, the Jordan Peels, the Mike Flanagans. Those 4 right there could easily slide into the top 10. I could even see them maybe knocking out like Wes Craven from my top 5.
The next elder statesman.
Yeah.
And do you not consider Hitchcock a horror director?
I don't. I think there's 2 films that you could say count.
The Birds and Psycho?
The Birds and Psycho are the 2 films that could count. What's funny is it all depends on what day you catch me on how I classify those films as being horror films or not. List your top 10 favorite horror films. And there's some obvious ones that no matter what, no matter how I categorize anything else, are always going to make the list. The Shining, The Exorcist,
Rosemary's Baby.
Rosemary's Baby are up there. The Thing.
In fact, Alien and The Thing probably round out your top 5.
Well,
Maybe Texas Chainsaw?
actually, Alien's a perfect example, though.
Oh, thank you.
But I sort of do this thing where when I'm thinking about that, I don't count Alien. Undeniably, Alien is in the top 5 of any film that I would list that could possibly fit into horror. And without question, Alien fits into the horror genre.
Right.
But
But you think of it as sci-fi?
if I was walking through a video store back in the day, if I was managing this Blockbuster Video and could put the movies in any section,
Take me back, Jeremiah.
I would put Alien, in large part because aliens exist, in the sci-fi section, not in the horror section. Even though so much of what I love about that movie, and the reason why it's my favorite movie in the franchise, is because it is such a strong horror movie.
But then over in staff picks, Jeremiah, we would see Alien.
But then when Halloween comes around and it's horror picks, it might not be up there.
Fair enough.
So Psycho to me sort of rides that line where it undeniably is a huge influence on horror genre. It undeniably is totally appropriate to watch around Halloween. It undeniably is early slasher prototype. But I almost just put it in that Hitchcock thriller genre because I feel like it belongs with the rest of Hitchcock's films, and the rest of Hitchcock films are going to be in the thriller section. The rest of the Alien films are going to be in the sci-fi section. Something like Jaws is going to be in the adventure section. Silence of the Lambs is going to be in the thriller section. Yet undeniably, they all could be considered horror films, in which case those would populate my top 10, along with The Shining and The Exorcist and a couple of obvious ones.
Right.
But thus, they would bump out Nightmare on Elm Street. They would bump out Night of the Living Dead. They would bump out Carrie. All these films that I really do want to squeeze into that top 10 horror list.
Truly, no one can deny you and Indiana Jones have strong feelings about where things belong.
Right.
So you're in good company.
Yes. I guess along those lines, just take a hot take. And again, if I had a video store, I would put this where everyone else puts it, in the action franchise. But the very first Terminator, kind of a horror film. Sarah Connor, kind of a final girl.
Absolutely.
Sarah Connor is a perfect prototype, perfect example of the final girl. Yes, it's got sci-fi elements, just like Alien has sci-fi elements. Yes, it has
Action elements.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is an action star. But until you get to Terminator 2, I don't know if it's really an action movie.
I just recently heard someone making that very point. They were saying that Terminator 2 is an action sci-fi movie, but Terminator is a horror movie.
He is stalking the final girl the same way Michael Myers or Jason stalks his victims. He's the unstoppable machine. She is living the nightmare. There are ever victims in the wake that he's hunting down. Ever Sarah Connor is trying to get to her.
So what you're really saying is James Cameron just made your top 5 horror directors? Suck it, Carpenter.
Carpenter, you're out. Sorry, Craven.
2 laps, hit the showers.
Carpenter's a USC guy, so I got to let him stay in.
That's true.
Just to represent.
Trojan for life.
Exactly.
It's taken me half an hour, but I think I can finally give a more
generous description of my feelings on Cronenberg and the way I really think of the man as a genre unto himself.
Yeah, okay.
It doesn't hurt that you just brought up Schwarzenegger, and in a way, kind of a genre unto himself.
Exactly, yeah. And that's what ends up inevitably putting Terminator and obviously the sequels being more action. Over in that action section,
Yep.
he is a character that redefines what the movie is. And Cronenberg, as a director, redefines what that movie is.
Kind of a reminder that all genres are a bit arbitrary, just as borders are just lines on a map.
Yeah, for sure. We're just making this up as we go along, folks.
We covered everything I had, and then another 45 minutes worth. So
Okay, yeah, excellent.
this wrap up might become 2 parts. Should maybe say this as a special or something for down the road, because I think the base episode itself is going to be like 5 parts. It is. We're going to be in the Guinness Book, man. We spent way too much time talking about one episode of Friday the 13th. The series.
The episode itself is 45 minutes, 10 hours later.
Exactly.
Oh, man.
There's nothing as satisfying as stumbling across the finish line. That finally, completely, absolutely, definitively wraps up our episode 12 review forever and ever. But Jeremiah claims the next episode connects to this one, so he's decided to stick around for lucky episode 13. Although I secretly suspect he divines meaning out of being a part of the 13th episode of a show with 13 in the title. Whatever the reason, join us next time for one of IMDb's top-rated episodes, The Baron's Bride, an episode about a haunted cape or something weird. Thanks for listening, everyone. We know you have a lot of choices when choosing a Friday the 13th the Series podcast, and we sincerely thank you for choosing ours. Jason and body horror would be a bit redundant, so it's better he show up later. Special thanks to Joshua Romeo for original music and to Stephen Yu for original art. And be sure to check out the Joe on Joe podcast, the only podcast where Joe Schlepsky discusses G.I. Joe. If you want to support our show, you can leave a review and rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. If you want an occasional update on our projects, you can sign up for our newsletter at the Inner Demon Entertainment website. And if you want to complain about social media with us on social media, you can find links on our website. Remember when we admitted how creepy the items can be? We'll find out together next time if there's any way that can be true of a cape. And always remember what Carl said to Frylock. It don't matter. None of this matters. Good night, everybody.